The convoy radio crackled with static as Sergeant Maya Rodriguez gripped the steering wheel of her supply truck, knuckling white against the desert camouflage of her gloves. What had started as a routine delivery of ammunition and medical supplies to Forward Operating Base Kestrel was about to become the longest night of her military career. In less than 3 hours, this 24-year-old logistics specialist from Phoenix would find herself making split-second decisions that would determine whether 8 wounded soldiers lived or died in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But Maya's story doesn't begin with gunfire and chaos. It begins 6 months earlier in the sterile hallways of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where her biggest concern was ensuring that toilet paper shipments arrived on schedule. Maya Rodriguez had never wanted to be a hero. Growing up in the sprawling suburbs of Phoenix, she'd watched her older brother Marcus come home from his first deployment with haunted eyes and shaking hands, speaking in fragments about firefights and fallen friends. When she enlisted 3 years later, she deliberately chose the most unglamorous military occupation she could find, 9-2A, Automated Logistical Specialist. Let someone else carry the rifles and kick down doors. Maya would handle the paperwork, track the inventory, and keep the war machine fed and supplied from the safety of rear echelon bases. Her military, occupational specialty training at Fort Lee, Virginia, had been exactly what she'd hoped for: methodical, predictable, and mercifully free of explosions. She'd excelled at learning the complex web of supply chains that kept modern armies functioning. From bullets to bandages, from fuel to food, everything had to be ordered, tracked, shipped, received, and distributed with mathematical precision. One miscalculation could leave soldiers without ammunition in a firefight, or medics without morphine when casualties started pouring in. The instructors at Fort Lee had drilled into their students that logistics was the backbone of warfare. Amateurs talk about tactics, their gruff sergeant major would bark during morning formations. But professionals study logistics. Maya had found comfort in those words. She could serve her country without ever having to point a weapon at another human being. She could contribute to the mission while staying far from the sharp end of combat. Her first assignment had been to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, where she'd spent 18 months managing supply inventories for an infantry battalion. The work was demanding but safe. She'd arrive at the supply warehouse before dawn, coffee in hand, and spend her days reconciling requisition forms, coordinating shipments, and ensuring that every piece of equipment was accounted for. The most dangerous thing she encountered was the occasional forklift operator who'd had too much coffee and not enough sleep. Maya had developed a reputation for efficiency and attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. While other logistics specialists might sign off on a shipment after a cursory inspection, Maya would count every case of MREs, verify every serial number on night vision devices, and double-check every medical supply against the packing manifests. Her meticulous nature had earned her early promotion to sergeant and the respect of both her peers and the infantry soldiers whose lives depended on her getting the details right. The closest she'd come to combat during those 18 months was listening to deployment briefings and helping pack equipment for battalions rotating to Afghanistan and Iraq. She'd watch the infantry soldiers load their gear, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension, and feel a complex blend of relief and guilt that she wouldn't be joining them. Her job was to stay behind, to keep the home fires burning, to ensure that the next wave of soldiers would have everything they needed when their turn came. But the Army had other plans for Sergeant Maya Rodriguez. The orders came on a Tuesday morning in March, printed on official letterhead and delivered by a stone-faced personnel clerk, who offered no explanation beyond the requirement that Maya report to the brigade headquarters within 2 hours. She'd assumed it was a routine reassignment, perhaps to another logistics unit at Bragg, or maybe a promotion board appearance. Instead, she found herself sitting across from Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the brigade's executive officer, who was studying Maya's personnel file with the intense focus of a surgeon examining X-rays. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the colonel had begun, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who'd spent 20 years climbing the military hierarchy. "You've been selected for deployment to Afghanistan as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. You'll be assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, providing logistics support for special operations missions in the Kunar province." Maya's stomach had dropped like a stone. Rangers, special operations. The words conjured images of midnight raids, helicopter insertions, and the kind of close-quarters combat that made the evening news. This wasn't the safe rear echelon assignment she'd signed up for. This was as close to the tip of the spear as a logistics specialist could get without actually carrying a rifle into battle. "Ma'am," Maya had managed, her voice steadier than she'd felt, "I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of assignment. My experience is in conventional logistics operations, not special operations support." Colonel Hayes had leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Sergeant, do you know why you were selected for this assignment?" When Maya shook her head, the colonel had continued. "Because in 18 months, you've never had a single discrepancy in your inventory reports. Not one. Your requisition accuracy rate is 98.7%, which is the highest in the brigade. When Rangers are operating behind enemy lines, they can't afford to run out of ammunition because someone miscounted the magazines or forgot to order medical supplies because they were too lazy to check the expiration dates." The colonel had stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade field where new soldiers were conducting their morning physical training. "The Rangers requested you specifically, Sergeant Rodriguez. They've reviewed your file, and they want the best logistics support they can get. That's you." Maya had felt a flutter of pride mixed with terror. The Rangers, the Army's elite light infantry unit, had requested her by name. It was the kind of professional recognition that most soldiers could only dream of. But it also meant leaving the comfortable predictability of garrison life for the chaos and danger of a combat zone. The deployment preparation had been a whirlwind of medical examinations, equipment fittings, and briefings on everything from improvised explosive devices to Afghan cultural customs. Maya had been issued body armor for the first time in her military career, not the lightweight protective vest worn during training exercises, but the heavy, ceramic-plated armor designed to stop rifle bullets and shrapnel. The weight of it on her shoulders had been a constant reminder that she was no longer in the safe rear areas. She'd grown accustomed to that. Her weapons training had been intensive and sobering. While logistics specialists were required to maintain basic proficiency with the M4 carbine, Maya's new assignment demanded a higher level of combat readiness. She'd spent hours on the firing range, learning to operate under stress, to reload quickly, and to engage targets at various distances. The instructors had been blunt about the realities of combat in Afghanistan. There were no safe areas, no guaranteed rear echelons, and logistics convoys were prime targets for insurgent attacks. The night before her deployment, Maya had called her parents from her barracks room at Fort Bragg. Her mother had cried, as she always did when Maya was preparing for any kind of military travel, even routine training exercises. Her father, a veteran of the Gulf War, had been characteristically stoic, offering practical advice about keeping her equipment clean and staying alert. But it was her brother Marcus who'd given her the words she'd carried with her on the plane to Afghanistan. "Maya," he'd said, his voice serious over the crackling phone connection, "I know you think you're just going over there to count bullets and track supply shipments. But you're going to see things, and you're going to have to do things that you never expected. When that happens, and it will happen, remember that you're stronger than you think you are. And remember that every soldier over there is somebody's brother or sister, somebody's son or daughter. Take care of them, and they'll take care of you. The flight to Bagram Airfield was Maya's first time leaving the United States. Packed into a military transport plane with 200 other soldiers, she'd tried to sleep during the 18-hour journey, but found herself staring out the small porthole windows at the endless expanse of ocean, then desert, then mountains. Each mile took her further from the familiar world of garrison, logistics, and closer to a reality she couldn't fully comprehend. Bagram had been a shock to her senses. The base was enormous, a sprawling city of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and constant activity. The air was filled with the sound of helicopters, the rumble of armored vehicles, and the distant boom of artillery fire that reminded everyone that they were in a war zone. The smell was unforgettable, a mixture of diesel fuel, burning trash, and the fine dust that seemed to penetrate everything, despite the best efforts of air filtration systems. Her first week at Bagram had been spent in orientation briefings and administrative processing. Maya had learned about the complex network of forward operating bases scattered throughout Afghanistan, each one a small fortress in hostile territory that depended entirely on regular resupply missions for survival. She'd studied maps of the Hindu Kush Mountains, memorizing the locations of landing zones, supply routes, and enemy activity areas. The briefings had been filled with acronyms and military jargon, but the underlying message was clear. Logistics personnel in Afghanistan weren't just moving supplies from point A to point B. They were lifelines for soldiers operating in some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. Her assignment to forward Operating Base Phoenix in the Kunar province had come with a warning from the transportation officer who'd handed her the orders. "Kunar's Indian country," he'd said, using the military slang for areas with heavy enemy activity. "The Rangers up there are running operations every night, and they go through supplies like water. You'll be flying convoys up there twice a week, minimum. Keep your head down and your weapon clean." The helicopter flight to Phobe Phoenix had been Maya's introduction to the breathtaking and terrifying landscape of eastern Afghanistan. The mountains rose like ancient fortresses from the valley floors, their peaks disappearing into clouds that looked close enough to touch. Rivers carved deep gorges through the rocky terrain, creating natural highways that had been used by smugglers, fighters, and armies for thousands of years. From the air, it was easy to see why this region had been called the graveyard of empires. Phobe Phoenix itself was smaller than Maya had expected, a collection of hardened buildings and defensive positions carved into a mountainside overlooking the Kunar River Valley. The base housed about 300 soldiers, mostly Rangers and Special Operations Support personnel, along with a handful of Afghan National Army troops and interpreters. Everything about the base spoke to its precarious position in hostile territory. The walls were higher, the guard towers more numerous, and the defensive positions more elaborate than anything Maya had seen during her training. Her living quarters were a shipping container that had been converted into a two-person room, complete with air conditioning, internet access, and a small refrigerator that she shared with her roommate, Specialist Jennifer Walsh from the communications section. The accommodations were Spartan but functional, a far cry from the comfortable barracks room she'd grown accustomed to at Fort Bragg. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya's workspace was a climate-controlled warehouse that served as the nerve center for all supply operations at Phobe Phoenix. The building was divided into sections for different types of equipment: weapons and ammunition in one area, medical supplies in another, food and water in a third. Everything was cataloged, tracked, and secured according to strict protocols, designed to prevent theft, loss, or enemy infiltration. Her first month at Phobe Phoenix had been a learning experience unlike anything in her military career. The pace of operations was relentless, with Rangers conducting missions almost every night and requiring constant resupply of ammunition, batteries, medical supplies, and specialized equipment. Maya had quickly discovered that textbook logistics. Procedures meant little when helicopters were taking enemy fire during supply runs, or when urgent requests for medical supplies came in at 3 in the morning from teams in contact with enemy forces. She'd adapted quickly to the demands of combat. Logistics. Developing informal networks with helicopter crews, developing workarounds for bureaucratic supply procedures, and learning to prioritize requests based on the tactical situation rather than administrative convenience. Her attention to detail, which had earned her recognition at Fort Bragg, became a matter of life and death at FOB Phoenix. A miscounted case of medical supplies could mean the difference between saving a wounded soldier's life and watching him die. From blood loss, the Rangers had initially been skeptical of their new logistics sergeant. Special operations soldiers tended to be protective of their equipment and suspicious of anyone who hadn't proven themselves in combat. But Maya's competence and dedication had gradually won their respect. She'd learned to anticipate their needs, often having supplies ready before they were requested. She'd worked 18-hour days to ensure that mission-critical equipment was available when teams needed it. Most importantly, she'd never let them down. But respect was a double-edged sword. As Maya had proven her reliability, the Rangers had begun including her in planning sessions and mission briefings that went far beyond her official responsibilities. She'd found herself studying target folders, learning about enemy positions, and understanding the tactical situation in ways that made her acutely aware of the dangers her colleagues faced every time they left the wire. It was during one of these briefings, on a humid evening in September, that Maya had first heard about the mission that would change everything. The Rangers were planning a series of operations targeting a high-value individual believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces in the region. The missions would require forward positioning of supplies at a remote outpost called Observation Post Viper, a tiny base located on a mountain ridge 20 miles from FOB Phoenix. Viper was little more than a reinforced bunker system manned by a dozen soldiers, but its position overlooked key infiltration routes used by enemy fighters moving between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Rangers needed to preposition supplies at Op Viper to support their operations, but the location was too dangerous for routine convoy operations. The only way to get supplies to the outpost was by helicopter, and recent intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces in the area had acquired shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. Maya had volunteered for the supply mission without hesitation. It was exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn her to military service in the first place, a complex logistical problem that required creative solutions and meticulous planning. She'd spent 3 days calculating load weights, coordinating with helicopter crews, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. Everything had been planned down to the last detail, everything except what actually happened. The CH-47 Chinook helicopter lifted off from FOB Phoenix at 0347 hours on October 15th, its twin rotors cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as Maya secured the cargo straps one final time. The helicopter's cargo bay was packed with precisely calculated supplies: 2,400 rounds of 5.56 millimeters ammunition, 48 cases of MREs, medical supplies including emergency surgical kits, radio batteries, night vision device batteries, and specialized equipment for the Rangers' upcoming operations. Maya had personally inspected every item, verifying serial numbers and expiration dates with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined her military career. Chief Warrant Officer Derek Thompson, the Chinook's pilot, had briefed Maya on the flight plan during their pre-mission coordination. The route would take them northeast from FOB Phoenix, following the Kuna River Valley before turning into the mountains toward Op Viper. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity along the route, and the early morning timing was designed to minimize the risk of encountering insurgent forces who typically moved during daylight hours. The flight was expected to take 45 minutes each way, with a 20-minute unloading period at Oppie Viper. Maya had made the supply run 6 times over the past 2 months, and each mission had followed the same routine: load the supplies, fly to the destination, unload quickly and efficiently, and return to base before the sun climbed high enough to make the helicopter an easy target for enemy observers. She'd developed a working relationship with the crew chiefs, Staff Sergeant Carlos Mendoza and Sergeant First Class Rebecca Harrison, who helped her optimize the loading procedures to minimize time on the ground at remote outposts. But as the Chinook banked northeast toward the mountains, Maya noticed subtle differences in the crew's behavior. Thompson's usual pre-flight banter was replaced by terse radio communications with air traffic control. Mendoza was checking his N-240 machine gun more frequently than usual, and Harrison kept scanning the mountains below with night vision binoculars. The tension was subtle but unmistakable to someone who'd flown enough combat missions to recognize when experienced. Soldiers were genuinely concerned. 20-3 minutes into the flight, Maya's world exploded into chaos. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the Chinook's aft rotor, assembly with a flash of orange flame and a metallic shriek that seemed to split the universe in half. The helicopter lurched violently to the right, throwing Maya against the cargo netting as loose equipment crashed around the cargo bay. The steady thrum of the twin rotors became an irregular grinding noise that spoke of catastrophic mechanical failure. Through the chaos, she could hear Thompson's voice over the intercom, calm and professional despite the emergency. Taking fire. We have damage to the aft rotor. Emergency landing procedures in effect. Maya's training kicked in with automatic precision. During her pre-deployment preparation, she'd undergone survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training that included helicopter crash scenarios. She secured herself against the cargo bay wall, protected her head and neck, and prepared for what the instructors had euphemistically called controlled flight into terrain. But no amount of training could prepare her for the stomach-dropping sensation of a 30,000-pound helicopter falling out of the sky with failing rotors. Thompson managed to maintain partial control during the descent, using his extraordinary skill and the helicopter's remaining flight capabilities to guide them toward a relatively flat area between 2 ridgelines. The Chinook hit hard, bouncing twice before sliding across the rocky ground in a shower of sparks and debris. The impact threw Maya forward against her restraints hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs, but the cargo netting and her safety harness prevented serious injury. The silence that followed the crash was more terrifying than the noise had been. Maya's ears were ringing from the impact, but she could hear the distant sound of the helicopter's engines winding down and the crackle of small fires from damaged electrical systems. More ominously, she could hear voices shouting in a language that definitely wasn't English, coming from the ridgelines around their crash site. "Everyone sound off." Thompson's voice crackled through the intercom system, which had somehow survived the crash. "Rodriguez, you okay back there?" Maya tested her arms and legs, checking for injuries beyond the bruises and scrapes that were inevitable in any helicopter crash. "I'm mobile," she reported, using the military terminology that meant she was injured but functional. "Cargo bay is secure, no fires visible." Mendoza and Harrison reported minor injuries but remained combat effective. Thompson had sustained a head injury that was bleeding heavily but hadn't affected his consciousness or motor functions. The Chinook's crew chief, Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, had suffered a broken arm during the crash but was alert and capable of performing her duties. The tactical situation became clear within minutes of the crash. The helicopter had gone down in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridgelines that provided excellent observation and fields of fire for enemy forces. Radio communications with FOB Phoenix were intermittent due to the mountainous terrain, but Thompson had managed to transmit their approximate location and status before the main radio system failed. However, the earliest possible rescue operation wouldn't arrive for at least 4 hours, and that assumed optimal weather conditions and no enemy interference. Enemy forces were already moving toward the crash site. Maya could see muzzle flashes from several positions on the surrounding ridges, and the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles echoed through the valley. The insurgents were using fire and movement tactics, advancing down the slopes while maintaining covering fire from elevated positions. It was a textbook assault on a downed aircraft, and Maya realized with growing dread that the enemy had probably been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Thompson took charge with the calm authority of a pilot who'd survived 3 previous helicopter crashes during his military career. "We're going to establish a defensive perimeter around the aircraft and hold until rescue arrives," he announced. "Rodriguez, I need you to inventory our weapons and ammunition. Santos, check the radio equipment and see if you can establish communications with higher headquarters. Mendoza and Harrison, start setting up defensive positions." Maya had never been in a ground combat situation, but her logistics training had included detailed knowledge of weapons and ammunition. The Chinook's crew was armed with personal weapons, M4 carbines, with 210 rounds of ammunition each, plus the door-mounted M240 machine guns with approximately 800 rounds per gun. Maya's own M4 carbine carried 6 30-round magazines, giving the 5-person crew a total of approximately 2,730 rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition. Under normal circumstances, that would be more than enough firepower to hold off a small insurgent force until rescue arrived. But their circumstances were far from normal. The enemy had the high ground, numerical superiority, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. More critically, Maya could see additional muzzle flashes appearing on the ridgelines as more insurgent fighters moved into position. What had started as a small patrol engagement was rapidly developing into a major firefight. The first concentrated attack came just after dawn, as the rising sun eliminated the crew's night vision advantage while providing the insurgents with clear observation of the crash site. Maya found herself lying behind a pile of aircraft debris, her M4 carbine aimed at muzzle flashes on the eastern ridgeline, trying to remember everything she'd learned during combat training about sight alignment, trigger control, and breathing techniques. The firefight was unlike anything she'd experienced during training exercises. The incoming fire was constant and accurate, forcing the crew to keep their heads down while trying to return effective fire at targets they could barely see. The sound was overwhelming, the crack of incoming bullets, the metallic ping of ricochets off the helicopter's hull, the steady chatter of Mendoza's M240 machine gun, and the occasional explosion of rocket-propelled grenades that sent shrapnel whistling through the air. Maya's first kill came during the second hour of the firefight. She'd been watching a specific rock formation on the northern ridge where she'd seen repeated muzzle flashes, waiting for the insurgent fighter to expose himself again. When he finally appeared, moving between covered positions, Maya's training took over. She aligned her sights, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, steady pressure her instructors had drilled into her during countless hours on the firing range. The insurgent dropped immediately, his AK-47 clattering down the rocky slope. Maya felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and revulsion that she'd never experienced before. She'd taken a human life, something she'd never expected to do when she'd chosen logistics as her military specialty. But she'd also eliminated a threat to her crew, and in the context of their desperate situation, that seemed like the only thing that mattered. The crew's ammunition supply became Maya's primary concern as the firefight dragged on. Combat consumption Rates for small arms ammunition were always higher than peacetime estimates, and their situation demanded almost constant suppressive fire to keep the insurgents from overrunning their position. Maya found herself crawling between defensive positions, redistributing ammunition and keeping careful track of how many rounds each crew member had remaining. By mid-morning, their tactical situation had deteriorated significantly. Santos had managed to establish intermittent radio contact with Phobe Phoenix, but the messages were fragmented and difficult to understand through the static and interference caused by the mountainous terrain. The rescue operation was delayed due to weather conditions and the need to coordinate with additional air assets to suppress enemy air defenses in the area. More troubling was the evidence that enemy forces were being reinforced. Maya counted at least 12 separate firing positions on the surrounding ridges, and the volume and accuracy of incoming fire suggested that they were facing a much larger force than initially estimated. The insurgents were also demonstrating tactical sophistication that went beyond simple ambush techniques, using coordinated fire and movement to gradually close the distance to the crash site. Thompson made the decision that probably saved their lives during the third hour of the firefight. Instead of maintaining a static defense around the helicopter, he ordered the crew to move to a more defensible position on higher ground about 200 meters from the crash site. The movement was dangerous. They had to cross open ground while under fire, but the new position offered better fields of fire and more natural cover. Maya's role during the movement was to carry the crew's remaining ammunition and medical supplies while providing covering fire for her teammates. It was the first time she'd ever moved under enemy fire, and the experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. Every instinct screamed at her to find cover and stay there, but her training and loyalty to her crew drove her forward across the exposed terrain. The new defensive position was anchored around a cluster of large boulders that provided excellent protection from small arms fire and reasonable concealment from enemy observation. Maya used her logistics expertise to organize their remaining supplies, creating ammunition distribution points and establishing a casualty collection area where wounded crew members could receive medical treatment. Harrison had been wounded during the movement, taking a bullet through the left shoulder that had missed major blood vessels but rendered her left arm largely useless. Maya found herself applying field dressings and administering pain medication, skills she'd learned during military medical training but never expected to use in combat. Harrison remained conscious and alert, insisting that she could still fight effectively with her right arm. The afternoon brought a new tactical challenge as the insurgents began using indirect fire weapons. Maya heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds and threw herself flat against the rocky ground as explosions erupted around their position. The enemy had somehow acquired 82mm mortar and was using them to systematically target the crew's defensive positions. Maya's understanding of battlefield logistics told her that their situation was becoming untenable. The crew was running low on ammunition, they had wounded personnel who needed medical evacuation, and the enemy was demonstrating capabilities that suggested this was a planned operation rather than an opportunistic attack on a downed aircraft. Most critically, the rescue operation had been delayed indefinitely due to the enemy's surface-to-air missile capabilities, but it was during this darkest period of the firefight that Maya noticed something that would prove crucial to their survival. While inventorying their remaining supplies, she'd discovered that the helicopter's cargo bay contained more than just routine logistics supplies. Hidden beneath the cases of MREs and ammunition were wooden crates marked with special handling designations that indicated they contained sensitive military equipment. Maya's security clearance allowed her to examine the crates, and what she found inside changed everything. The Rangers had been using her supply runs to pre-position specialized communications equipment at Op Viper, high-frequency radios capable of satellite communication and encrypted data transmission. The equipment was far more sophisticated than anything normally found at small outposts, and Maya realized that the Rangers' upcoming operations were much more significant than she'd been led to believe. More importantly, she understood why the insurgents had been waiting for their helicopter. This hadn't been a random attack on a logistics flight. The enemy had specific intelligence about the communications equipment and had planned an operation to capture or destroy it. The fact that they'd positioned surface-to-air missiles along the flight route and had reinforcements ready to attack the crash site suggested a level of operational planning that went far beyond typical insurgent capabilities. As the sun began to set on what had become the longest day of Maya's military career, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. The crew couldn't wait for rescue. They had to take the initiative. And Maya Rodriguez, logistics specialist from Phoenix, Arizona, was about to become something she'd never planned to be, a combat leader responsible for 8 wounded soldiers, whose only chance of survival depended on her ability to turn a failed supply mission into a successful rescue operation. The transformation had already begun during the hours of firefight, but Maya wouldn't fully understand what she'd become until she found herself planning an assault on an enemy position, calculating ammunition requirements for offensive operations, and preparing to lead her crew on a nighttime movement through hostile territory toward an objective she'd never seen before. The girl who'd chosen logistics to avoid combat was about to discover that in war, there's no such thing as a non-combatant. There are only soldiers, and Maya Rodriguez was about to prove that the best soldiers are often the ones who never expected to be heroes. The encrypted radio transmission that changed everything came through at 2,147 hours, crackling with static as Technical Sergeant Santos adjusted the salvaged communications equipment she'd managed to repair using spare parts from the helicopter's avionics bay. Maya was redistributing their dwindling ammunition supplies when Santos's urgent whisper cut through the darkness of their rocky defensive position. "Rodriguez, you need to hear this," Santos hissed, pressing the earpiece into Maya's hand. "It's coming from Op Viper, but it's not the usual check-in protocol." Maya pressed the earpiece to her ear and immediately recognized the voice of Staff Sergeant Michael Chun, the senior NCO at Observation Post Viper. But Chun wasn't following standard radio procedures. Instead, he was transmitting in the emergency brevity codes reserved for immediate threat situations, his normally calm voice tight with stress. Any station, this is Viper Base. We have 8, repeat 8, urgent surgical casualties requiring immediate evacuation. Primary landing zone is compromised by effective enemy fire. Secondary LZ is unusable due to terrain damage. Request immediate medical support and reinforcement. Enemy forces have overrun perimeter positions. Charlie and Delta, we are falling back to the bunker complex and may not be able to hold much longer. Maya felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. Oppie Viper, the destination for her original supply mission, was under coordinated attack at the same time her helicopter had been shot down. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated enemy operation designed to eliminate both the observation post and prevent any possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Thompson crawled over to Maya's position, his head wound bandaged with field dressings that were already soaked with blood. "What's the situation at Viper?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the worst. Maya keyed the RADIO, breaking protocol by transmitting without authorization from higher headquarters. In their current situation, standard procedures seemed less important than getting accurate intelligence about what they were facing. "Viper Base, this is Phoenix Supply 7. What is your current strength and supply status?" Chun's response confirmed Maya's worst fears. "Phoenix Supply 7, we have 4 effective personnel remaining. Primary weapon systems are down due to ammunition shortage. Medical supplies exhausted. We've got multiple penetrating trauma cases that need surgical intervention within the next few hours, or we're going to lose them. Maya's logistics trading automatically began calculating the tactical mathematics of their situation. Opivo was located approximately 8 kilometers northeast of their current position, across terrain that intelligence reports had described as heavily infiltrated by enemy forces. The observation post's garrison had been reduced from 12 soldiers to 4 effectives, with 8 wounded requiring immediate medical evacuation. Meanwhile, her own crew consisted of 5 personnel, one with a serious head injury and another with a wounded shoulder that limited her combat effectiveness. But Maya's analysis went beyond simple numbers. Her detailed knowledge of Op Viper's supply situation told her that Chun's report of ammunition shortage was particularly alarming. The observation post had been resupplied just 5 days earlier, with enough ammunition for 2 weeks of normal operations. If they'd exhausted their supply in a single engagement, they'd faced a much larger enemy force than anyone had anticipated. More critically, Maya knew exactly what medical supplies had been delivered to Op Viper during previous missions. The post's aid station was equipped for basic trauma care, bandages, pain medication, and emergency first aid supplies, but nothing approaching the surgical capabilities needed for multiple penetrating trauma cases. The wounded soldiers at Op Viper would die without immediate evacuation to a field hospital, and the tactical situation made helicopter evacuation impossible. Santos managed to establish contact with FOB Phoenix long enough to relay Op Viper's situation to the Tactical Operations Center. The response was predictably frustrating. All aviation assets were grounded due to enemy surface-to-air missile threats, and the nearest ground relief force was at least 12 hours away. The soldiers at Op Viper didn't have 12 hours. Maya found herself studying the terrain between their position and Op Viper using a map and compass by the dim light of a red-filtered flashlight. The route would take them through the coast valley, across 2 ridgelines, and through an area that intelligence reports had identified as a primary infiltration route for enemy fighters moving between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Under normal circumstances, it would be considered impassable for a small unit carrying wounded personnel. But Maya's perspective on the situation was shaped by her unique understanding of the logistical requirements for sustaining combat operations in mountainous terrain. She'd spent months studying the supply routes, cache locations, and movement patterns used by both coalition forces and insurgent groups in the region. More importantly, she'd personally delivered supplies to Op Viper 6 times and had walked every meter of the observation post's defensive perimeter during previous missions. The idea that would save 8 lives began forming in Maya's mind as she traced potential routes on the map. Op Viper's location had been chosen specifically because it overlooked key terrain features that enemy forces used for movement and supply operations. But Maya realized that the same geographical advantages that made the observation post valuable for intelligence gathering also made it accessible through routes that weren't covered by standard intelligence assessments. During her previous supply missions to Op Viper, Maya had noticed a series of goat trails and seasonal stream beds that provided concealed approaches to the observation post from the southwest. The routes weren't suitable for vehicle movement, but they could be used by personnel on foot carrying supplies. More importantly, Maya's detailed knowledge of the observation post's layout told her that there was a secondary entrance to the bunker complex that could be accessed without exposing rescuers to fire from the primary approaches. Thompson listened to Maya's proposal with the focused attention of a pilot who'd learned to trust the tactical judgment of logistics specialists. Rodriguez, what you're describing is essentially a night infiltration mission across 8 kilometers of enemy-controlled terrain, carrying wounded personnel, with no fire support and minimal ammunition. Even if we managed to reach Op Viper, we'd still have to fight our way out with 12 people instead of 5. Maya's response came from a place of certainty that surprised her. Sir, Those 8 soldiers are going to die if we don't do something. The rescue operation isn't coming in time, and we're the only friendly force in the area. I know the terrain. I know the observation post's layout, and I have enough medical supplies in the helicopter's cargo bay to stabilize trauma casualties for evacuation. But Maya's real motivation went beyond tactical considerations. During her months at Phi Phoenix, she'd developed personal relationships with many of the soldiers who rotated through Op Viper. Chun had helped her develop more efficient supply procedures. During her early missions, Corporal David Park from the observation post's communications section had shared photos of his newborn daughter during a supply delivery just 2 weeks earlier. These weren't abstract casualties. They were colleagues and friends whose lives depended on her willingness to transform from a logistics specialist into a rescue mission leader. The crew's decision to attempt the rescue was unanimous, though Maya suspected that Thompson's head injury and Harrison's shoulder wound had impaired their judgment, enough to make a nearly impossible mission seem merely difficult. Mendoza and Santos were rangers themselves, and the idea of abandoning fellow soldiers was simply not acceptable regardless of the tactical risks involved. Maya's mission planning drew heavily on her logistics background, but applied those skills to offensive operations in ways she'd never been trained for. She calculated load weights for carrying wounded personnel across mountainous terrain, estimated ammunition requirements for fighting through enemy positions, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios they might encounter during the infiltration. The crew's equipment preparation took 3 hours and reflected Maya's obsessive attention to detail. She redistributed ammunition to ensure that each crew member carried the maximum possible load while maintaining mobility for the 8-kilometer movement. Medical supplies were repackaged into individual first aid kits that could be quickly accessed during combat. Food and water were limited to absolute minimums to reduce weight, with the understanding that the mission would either succeed quickly or fail catastrophically. Maya's personal preparation involved a fundamental shift in her understanding of her military role. She'd spent 3 years thinking of herself as a support soldier whose job was to enable others to accomplish the mission. But as she checked her M4 carbine and adjusted her body armor for the movement to Opie Viper, she realized that she'd become the mission commander, responsible for decisions that would determine whether 12 soldiers lived or died. The movement began at 0230 hours, with Maya leading the crew down a steep ravine that would provide concealment from enemy observation posts on the surrounding ridgelines. Her navigation was based on landmark recognition rather than GPS coordinates, using terrain features she'd memorized during previous helicopter flights to Op Viper. The pace was deliberately slow to minimize noise and avoid detection, but Maya was acutely aware that every minute of delay increased the likelihood that the wounded soldiers at Op Viper would die from their injuries. The first enemy contact came after 2 hours of movement, as the crew was crossing an exposed saddle between 2 peaks. Maya spotted the muzzle flash first, a brief flicker of light from a position about 400 meters to the northeast. The sniper's bullet passed close enough to Maya's head that she could hear the supersonic crack as it displaced the air. Near her left ear, Maya's response was immediate and instinctive. Instead of taking cover and returning fire, she led the crew in a flanking movement that used the terrain to approach the sniper's position from an unexpected direction. Her understanding of the enemy's likely observation capabilities, combined with her detailed knowledge of the local geography, allowed her to choose a route that remained concealed until they were close enough to engage the sniper with grenades. The firefight was brief but intense. Maya killed her second enemy fighter with a well-aimed burst from her M4 carbine, while Mendoza eliminated a second insurgent who'd been providing overwatch for the sniper. The engagement revealed that enemy forces were positioned along the primary approaches to Op Viper, but Maya's chosen route had allowed the crew to bypass most of the defensive positions More importantly, the firefight confirmed Maya's tactical assessment of the enemy's operational plan. The insurgents weren't simply conducting random attacks on coalition positions. They were executing a coordinated operation designed to isolate OP Viper and prevent any possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Maya's crew was moving through the middle of a much larger battlefield than anyone at Phobe Phoenix had realized. The final approach to OP Viper required Maya to navigate using memory and intuition rather than visible landmarks. The observation post's defensive positions were designed to be invisible from a distance, and Maya had to rely on her recollection of subtle terrain features to find the secondary entrance she'd noticed during previous supply missions. The route took them through a series of shallow caves and rock formations that provided excellent concealment, but made navigation extremely difficult in the darkness. Maya's first visual contact with OP Viper came at 0627 hours, as the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. The observation post was barely recognizable from her previous visits. The primary defensive positions had been destroyed by rocket-propelled grenades and mortar fire, and several of the above-ground structures were still burning. Most alarmingly, Maya could see enemy fighters moving through the outer perimeter, suggesting that the observation post's offensive line had been breached. Chung's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained desperation. "Any friendly forces in the area, this is Viper Base. We are down to our last magazine of ammunition and cannot hold the bunker entrance much longer. If anyone can hear this transmission, we have 8 soldiers who will die without immediate medical evacuation." Maya keyed her radio and transmitted the words that would define the rest of her military career. "Viper Base. This is Phoenix Supply 7. We are approximately 200 meters southwest of your position and preparing to assault through the enemy perimeter. Maintain your current positions and prepare to receive medical support." The silence that followed was broken by Chun's incredulous response. "Phoenix Supply 7. Say again your last transmission. Did you say you're preparing to assault our position?" Maya's answer came without hesitation. "Affirmative, Viper Base. Phoenix Supply 7 is a 5-person rescue element with medical supplies and ammunition. We are beginning our assault in approximately 10 minutes. Be prepared to guide us to the wounded upon our arrival." Maya Rodriguez, logistics specialist from Phoenix, Arizona, was about to lead her first infantry assault against a prepared enemy position, and 8 wounded soldiers were depending on her success. Maya crouched behind a boulder formation 200 meters from OP Viper's perimeter, studying the enemy positions through night vision binoculars she'd salvaged from the helicopters. Emergency equipment. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the tactical situation. At least 15 insurgent fighters had established firing positions around the observation post's defensive perimeter, with additional forces moving through the outer bunkers that had been overrun during the initial assault. The enemy's positioning demonstrated sophisticated tactical planning that went far beyond typical insurgent capabilities. They'd established interlocking fields of fire that covered all the traditional approaches to the observation post, while maintaining routes for reinforcement and resupply from positions on the surrounding ridgelines. Most critically, they'd positioned a heavy machine gun team in the ruins of OP Viper's communications bunker, giving them direct fire capability against the main entrance to the underground complex where Chun and his remaining soldiers were trapped. Maya's assault plan had to account for several factors that made conventional infantry tactics nearly impossible. Her 5-person crew was outnumbered at least 3-1 by enemy forces who held superior terrain and had intimate knowledge of the observation post's defensive layout. They had limited ammunition for a sustained firefight, no heavy weapons beyond Mendoza's M240 machine gun, and no possibility of fire support from artillery or air assets. But Maya's unique perspective as a logistics specialist provided advantages that traditional infantry leaders might have overlooked. Her detailed knowledge of OP Viper's supply routes, defensive positions, and underground tunnel system gave her tactical options that weren't available to enemy commanders who'd studied the position from external observation. More importantly, her understanding of the observation post's communications equipment and emergency procedures allowed her to coordinate with Chun's defenders in ways that could multiply the effectiveness of her small assault force. Maya's briefing to her crew reflected the transformation from logistics specialist to combat leader that had occurred during their night infiltration. "The enemy has numerical superiority in better positions," she began, speaking in the calm, methodical tone. She'd once used to discuss supply inventories, but they're expecting a conventional assault from the primary approaches. "We're going to hit them from a direction they can't observe and exploit their positioning against them." Her plan centered on a simultaneous assault from two directions that would force the enemy to divide their attention and firepower. Thompson and Santos would establish a supporting position on the eastern ridge and engage the heavy machine gun team with precision rifle fire, drawing the enemy's attention away from the main assault. Meanwhile, Maya would lead Mendoza and Harrison through the secondary tunnel entrance she'd identified during previous supply missions, emerging inside the observation post's perimeter to attack the enemy from behind. The timing had to be precise. Maya's assault element would need approximately 20 minutes to move through the tunnel system and reach their assault position. Thompson's supporting element would begin their diversionary attack exactly 21 minutes after Maya's element entered the tunnels, giving the assault team 60 seconds to reach their positions before the enemy's attention was focused elsewhere. Maya's movement through the tunnel system was unlike anything in her military experience. The tunnels had been carved from solid rock during Op Viper's construction, creating a network of passages that connected the observation post's various defensive positions. But the tunnels were never intended for tactical movement during combat operations. They were narrow, poorly ventilated, and filled with equipment and supplies that had been stored underground for protection from enemy fire. Navigating the tunnel system required Maya to rely on memory and spatial reasoning rather than maps or landmarks. She'd explored portions of the tunnels during previous supply missions, but never with the systematic thoroughness that tactical operations demanded. Each intersection required careful consideration of direction and distance, with the understanding that a wrong turn could lead them into a dead end or, worse, directly into enemy positions. The sounds of combat above ground provided a constant reminder of the urgency of their mission. Maya could hear the distinctive chatter of AK-47 rifles, the heavier reports of RPG launches, and the intermittent response of American weapons as Chun's defenders attempted to maintain their positions. Most ominously, she could hear voices shouting in Pashto and Arabic, indicating that enemy forces were attempting to coordinate an assault on the main bunker entrance. Maya's emergence from the tunnel system placed her assault element in the exact position she'd planned. Inside Op Viper's defensive perimeter, approximately 50 meters behind the enemy's forward positions. The tactical advantage was immediately apparent. The insurgent fighters were focused on the observation post's main bunker entrance and the supporting positions that Thompson's element would soon engage. None of them were expecting an attack from behind, and their positioning left them vulnerable to precisely the kind of assault Maya had planned. But the tactical situation was more complex than Maya's planning had anticipated. The enemy force was larger than her initial estimate, with additional fighters positioned in locations that weren't visible from her external observation. More critically, several of the insurgent positions were integrated with Op Viper's own defensive structures, making it difficult to engage enemy forces without risking damage to the facilities that housed the wounded soldiers she was trying to rescue. Maya's assault began with Harrison's sniper shot, a precisely aimed round that eliminated the insurgent fighter manning the heavy machine gun position in the communications bunker. The shot was perfectly timed to coincide with Thompson's diversionary attack from the eastern ridge. creating the confusion and misdirection that Maya's plan required. As enemy fighters turned their attention toward Thompson's position, Maya led Mendoza and Harrison in a rapid assault across the 50 meters of open ground that separated them from their primary objective. The firefight that followed was the most intense combat action of Maya's military career. Enemy fighters who had been caught completely off guard by the assault from behind attempted to reposition their weapons and coordinate their response, but Maya's element maintained the initiative through aggressive movement and accurate fire. Mendoza's M240 machine gun proved devastatingly effective at close range, suppressing enemy positions and preventing coordinated counterattacks. Maya found herself operating at a level of tactical proficiency that surprised her. Her understanding of weapons employment, movement techniques, and small unit tactics had been purely theoretical during her logistics training, but the knowledge translated seamlessly into practical application under combat conditions. More importantly, her detailed familiarity with Viper's layout allowed her to anticipate enemy movements and position her assault element for maximum effectiveness. The turning point in the assault came when Maya identified the enemy commander's position in the ruins of Viper's primary observation bunker. The insurgent leader was attempting to coordinate his force's response to the two-directional attack, using hand and arm signals to direct fighters to new positions. Maya's elimination of the enemy commander with a well-aimed burst from her M4 carbine disrupted the insurgents' coordination and created the opportunity for Chen's defenders to emerge from the main bunker and join the assault. Chen's appearance with his 3 remaining effective soldiers transformed the tactical situation from a desperate assault into a coordinated counterattack. The observation post's defenders had intimate knowledge of every defensive position and could direct the assault elements toward enemy locations that weren't visible from external observation. More importantly, their participation in the assault demonstrated to the insurgent fighters that Viper had not been completely overrun, and that continued resistance might be futile. The enemy's withdrawal was as well coordinated as their initial assault had been. Instead of fighting to the last man or attempting to hold positions that had become untenable, the insurgent fighters conducted a tactical retreat that preserved their remaining personnel while denying Maya's forces the opportunity for pursuit. Within 30 minutes of the assault's beginning, the last enemy muzzle flashes had disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Viper's defenders in control of their positions, but facing the massive challenge of treating 8 critically wounded soldiers. Maya's transition from assault leader to senior medical officer reflected the same adaptability that had characterized her entire military career. The wounded soldiers at Viper presented a complex triage situation that required both medical knowledge and logistical expertise. 3 of the casualties had penetrating abdominal wounds that required immediate surgical intervention. 2 had suffered traumatic amputations that needed emergency stabilization, and 3 others had various combinations of shrapnel wounds, burns, and traumatic brain injuries. The medical supplies that Maya had carried during the assault were sufficient for basic trauma care, but the surgical requirements exceeded anything she was trained or equipped to handle. However, her logistics background had given her detailed knowledge of the medical capabilities available at various coalition bases throughout Afghanistan. More importantly, her understanding of aviation assets and evacuation procedures allowed her to develop a plan for getting the wounded soldiers to appropriate medical facilities. Maya's coordination of the medical evacuation required her to simultaneously manage multiple complex requirements. She had to establish communications with FOB Phoenix and coordinate helicopter support, organize the wounded soldiers for evacuation according to medical priority, and prepare Viper's landing zone for incoming aircraft while maintaining security against possible enemy counterattacks. The helicopter evacuation that began at 0847 hours represented the successful completion of a mission that had started as a routine supply run and evolved into a complex combat rescue operation. Maya watched as the first UH-60 Black Hawk lifted off from OPU Viper's landing zone, carrying 4 of the most critically wounded soldiers, knowing that her decisions during the previous 18 hours had made the difference between life and death for 8 American soldiers. But Maya's mission wasn't complete with the successful evacuation of the wounded personnel. Op Viper had been severely damaged during the enemy assault, and the observation post's tactical value had been compromised by the enemy's detailed knowledge of its defensive layout. Maya found herself participating in the planning for Op Viper's evacuation and the establishment of new observation positions that would maintain surveillance of the critical terrain features in the area. The intelligence gathered during the assault and evacuation confirmed Maya's assessment that the enemy operation had been carefully planned and expertly executed. The insurgent forces had demonstrated capabilities that suggested significant training, equipment, and intelligence support. Most troubling was evidence that the enemy had possessed detailed information about Op Viper's defensive layout, supply schedules, and personnel strength that could only have come from sophisticated intelligence gathering operations. Maya's debriefing with intelligence officers from FOB Phoenix revealed the broader context of the operation she'd participated in. The simultaneous attacks on her supply helicopter and Op Viper were part of a larger enemy offensive designed to disrupt coalition operations throughout the Kunar province. Her successful rescue mission had prevented the enemy from achieving one of their primary objectives, but the intelligence gathered during the operation indicated that additional attacks were likely in the near future. The formal recognition of Maya's actions came 3 weeks later, during a ceremony at FOB Phoenix where she was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. But the award that meant the most to Maya came in the form of a letter from Corporal David Park, one of the soldiers she'd rescued from Op Viper, who had written from his hospital bed in Germany to thank her for saving his life and ensuring that he would be able to return home to his newborn daughter. Maya Rodriguez had begun her deployment as a logistics specialist, whose greatest ambition was to ensure that supply inventories were accurate and delivery schedules were maintained. She was ending it as a combat leader who had proven that the most important military specialty is the willingness to do whatever the mission requires, regardless of what it says on your personnel file. The supply run that had become a combat rescue had transformed not just Maya's understanding of her military role, but her understanding of what it means to be a soldier. 3 months after the rescue at Op Viper, Maya Rodriguez found herself sitting in a sterile conference room at the Pentagon, facing a panel of senior military officers who were struggling to understand how a logistics specialist had managed to accomplish what an entire infantry company might have failed to achieve. The room was filled with colonels and generals whose chest ribbons told stories of decades spent in combat zones around the world, but they were asking Maya to explain tactical decisions that had saved 8 lives and prevented a strategic intelligence loss that could have compromised operations throughout Afghanistan. The debriefing had been going on for 6 hours, with detailed questions about every aspect of the mission, from the initial helicopter crash to the final medical evacuations. Maya had answered each question with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to supply inventories, but she could see the confusion in the officers' faces when she described using logistics principles to plan infantry assaults and coordinate medical evacuations under Fire. General Patricia Morrison, the 3-star officer who headed the Army's Personnel Development Command, leaned forward across the polished conference table and asked the question that had been underlying the entire debriefing. Sergeant Rodriguez, in your opinion, what enabled you to succeed in a mission that would have challenged experienced infantry leaders with significantly more training and resources? Maya's response came from a perspective that had been fundamentally altered by 18 hours of combat that had compressed years of military evolution into a single transformative experience. Ma'am, I think my logistics background actually gave me advantages that traditional infantry training might not have provided. Logistics is fundamentally about understanding complex systems, anticipating requirements, and developing solutions under resource constraints. Those skills translated directly into tactical problem-solving under combat conditions. But Maya's explanation went deeper than tactical technique. Her success had been built on a foundation of relationships and trust that she'd developed during months of routine supply missions to remote outposts throughout Afghanistan. The soldiers at Op Viper had trusted her enough to provide detailed information about their tactical situation, and her crew had trusted her leadership enough to follow her into what appeared to be a suicide mission. Those relationships had been forged through countless small interactions during seemingly mundane logistics operations. The Pentagon debriefing was part of a broader analysis of the implications of Maya's mission for military training and personnel development. Traditional military doctrine assumed clear distinctions between combat arms specialties and support functions, with different training standards and expectations for soldiers in different roles. Maya's success had demonstrated that those distinctions might be less meaningful in the complex operational environment of modern warfare. Colonel James Fletcher, the infantry officer who had led the investigation into the Op Viper incident, presented his findings to the panel with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had spent months trying to understand tactical decisions that had initially seemed impossible. The enemy operation against Op Viper and the supply helicopter was part of a coordinated campaign designed to test our ability to maintain logistic support to remote positions. He explained. Sergeant Rodriguez's actions didn't just save 8 lives, they prevented the enemy from achieving their strategic objective of demonstrating that our forward positions were vulnerable to isolation and elimination. The intelligence analysis had revealed the full scope of what Maya had unknowingly disrupted. The enemy forces that had attacked Op Viper and her supply helicopter were part of a cell that had been planning similar operations against observation posts throughout eastern Afghanistan. Their success at Op Viper would have provided a template for attacks against other positions, potentially forcing the evacuation of the entire network of observation posts that provided early warning of enemy movement along the Pakistan border. Maya's mission had also recovered critical intelligence materials that the enemy had been attempting to capture. The specialized communications equipment that had been hidden in her supply cargo contained encrypted data about ongoing special operations missions throughout the region. If that equipment had fallen into enemy hands, it would have compromised dozens of ongoing operations and potentially resulted in significant coalition casualties. But the most significant aspect of Maya's debriefing wasn't the tactical analysis or intelligence implications. It was the recognition that her success had emerged from a combination of technical competence, situational awareness, and moral courage that wasn't limited to any specific military specialty. The officers conducting the debriefing were grappling with the realization that heroism often emerges from unexpected sources and that the most critical military capabilities might not be the ones that receive the most attention during peacetime training. The formal recognition of Maya's actions extended far beyond the Silver Star ceremony at Phobe Phoenix. She was selected for accelerated promotion to Staff Sergeant, assignment to the Army's Elite Ranger Regiment, and inclusion in advanced military education programs that were typically reserved for officers. But Maya found that the most meaningful recognition came from letters and emails from the soldiers she'd rescued and their families, thanking her for actions that had allowed husbands, fathers, and sons to return home safely. Maya's new assignment to the 75th Ranger Regiment represented a fundamental shift in her military career trajectory. Instead of managing supply inventories in rear echelon warehouses, she found herself planning logistic support for some of the Army's most sensitive special operations missions. Her unique combination of technical logistics expertise and proven combat leadership made her invaluable for operations that required both meticulous planning and the ability to adapt quickly when plans went wrong. The Rangers had initially been skeptical of a logistics specialist joining their ranks, but Maya's combat record and demonstrated tactical competence had earned their immediate respect. More importantly, her success had challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between combat arms and support specialties. Maya found herself working with Rangers who were eager to learn logistics principles that could enhance their operational effectiveness, while she continued developing infantry skills that complemented her technical expertise. Maya's first mission with the Rangers took place 8 months after the Viper rescue, when she planned and executed a complex resupply operation for a reconnaissance team that had been operating behind enemy lines for 3 weeks. The mission required precise coordination of helicopter insertions, cache emplacement, and extraction procedures that drew heavily on both her logistics background and her combat experience. The operation's success demonstrated that Maya's transformation from support specialist to combat leader was complete and permanent. But Maya's most significant contribution to military doctrine came through her participation in developing new training programs that integrated logistics and tactical skills for soldiers in all specialties. Her insights had helped create curricula that taught infantry soldiers to understand supply chain management while training logistics specialists in basic combat skills. The programs reflected a growing recognition that modern warfare required soldiers who could perform multiple roles and adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The broader impact of Maya's story extended beyond military training to questions about leadership development and the identification of potential in unexpected places. Her success had emerged not from specialized combat training or elite military education, but from dedication to excellence in routine tasks and the willingness to accept responsibility when circumstances demanded extraordinary action. Those qualities weren't limited to any specific military specialty or demographic group. Maya's speaking engagements at military academies and professional development conferences focused on the principle that had guided her actions during the Viper rescue: the understanding that every soldier has a responsibility to accomplish the mission, regardless of their official job description. She emphasized that heroism often emerges from competence in basic tasks rather than specialized training in dramatic skills, and that the most important military capability is the willingness to do whatever the situation requires. The personal cost of Maya's transformation from logistics specialist to combat leader became apparent during her psychological evaluations and counseling sessions following her return from Afghanistan. The 18 hours of continuous combat had created psychological scars that would require years of treatment and support. Maya struggled with survivor guilt, hypervigilance, and recurring nightmares that reflected the traumatic nature of her combat experiences. But she also found that her sense of purpose and accomplishment helped her cope with the psychological aftermath of combat in ways that surprised her counselors. Maya's relationship with her family had been fundamentally altered by her combat experience. Her parents struggled to reconcile their daughter's transformation from the quiet logistics specialist who had left for deployment with the combat veteran who had returned with the Silver Star and national recognition. Her brother Marcus, who had initially been protective of his younger sister's decision to join the military, found himself seeking her advice about combat experiences and leadership challenges he was facing in his own military career. The media attention surrounding Maya's story had created opportunities and challenges that she hadn't anticipated. Her success had made her a symbol of military diversity and the potential for individuals to exceed expectations. But Maya found the public recognition uncomfortable and often inconsistent with her understanding of what had actually happened during the Viper rescue. She preferred to focus on the team effort that had made the mission successful rather than individual heroism that media accounts emphasized. Maya's long-term Career plans reflected her commitment to using her unique combination of logistics expertise and combat experience to improve military effectiveness. She had been accepted for officer candidate school with the intention of pursuing a career that would allow her to influence military doctrine and training at the strategic level. Her goal was to ensure that future soldiers would be better prepared for the kind of complex operational environment that had transformed her. From a supply sergeant into a combat leader, the soldiers that Maya had rescued at Op Viper had become lifelong friends whose continued success validated the risks she had taken during their rescue. Corporal David Park had returned to active duty after recovering from his wounds and had named his second child after Maya. Staff Sergeant Michael Shun had been promoted and assigned to develop new defensive tactics for observation posts based on lessons learned during the Op Viper attack. Each of their achievements reinforced Maya's understanding that her actions had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Maya's story had become part of military folklore, told and retold in professional development courses, leadership seminars, and informal discussions among soldiers throughout the Army. But Maya understood that the most important aspect of her story wasn't the dramatic combat action or the formal recognition. It was the demonstration that excellence in routine tasks, dedication to mission accomplishment, and willingness to accept responsibility could transform ordinary soldiers into extraordinary leaders when circumstances demanded heroic action. 10 years after the Op Viper rescue, Colonel Maya Rodriguez stood before a graduating class of logistics officers at the Army's Logistics University, sharing the lessons she had learned during the supply run that had become a combat rescue. Her message to the new officers was simple but profound. Prepare for the job you have, but be ready for the job you might be asked to do. In the military, there are no non-essential personnel and no non-critical missions. Every soldier has the potential to make the difference between mission success and failure, between life and death, between victory and defeat. Maya Rodriguez had proven that heroism isn't limited by military occupational specialty, that leadership can emerge from unexpected sources, and that the most important military training is the development of character and competence that enables soldiers to rise to any challenge. Her legacy would continue to influence military training and doctrine for decades to come, ensuring that future soldiers would understand that in war, everyone is a warrior when the mission demands it. 15 years after that October night in Afghanistan, Brigadier General Maya Rodriguez walked through the halls of the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, carrying a worn manila folder containing the after-action report from the Op Viper rescue mission. Today marked her final lecture as the college's senior logistics instructor before taking command of the Army's 1st Sustainment Command, a position that would make her responsible for logistics operations across 3 continents. The auditorium was filled with 200 military officers from 37 countries, each representing the future leadership of their respective armed forces. Maya had delivered this lecture dozens of times over the past 5 years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was speaking to officers who included her own former students, soldiers who had been inspired by her story to pursue careers that bridged the traditional gap between combat operations and support functions. Maya opened her presentation with a simple question that had become her trademark. How many of you believe that logistics personnel are non-combatants? Nearly half the hands in the auditorium went up, a response that Maya had learned to expect from officers trained in conventional military doctrine. Her smile carried the weight of experience that had fundamentally challenged that assumption. Tonight, I want to tell you about a supply sergeant from Phoenix, Arizona, who discovered that there are no non-combatants in modern warfare, Maya began. Her name was Maya Rodriguez, and 18 hours of combat taught her that the most dangerous assumption a soldier can make is that someone else will handle the hard parts of the mission. Maya's retelling of the Op Viper story had evolved over the years into a masterclass in adaptive leadership under extreme conditions. She no longer focused on the tactical details of the helicopter crash or the mechanics of the assault through Op Viper's perimeter. Instead, she emphasized the decision-making process that had transformed a logistics specialist into a combat leader, and the principles that had enabled success when conventional wisdom suggested failure was inevitable. The lesson isn't that logistics soldiers should be trained as infantry fighters, Maya explained to the attentive audience. The lesson is that every soldier must be prepared to exceed their expected role when the mission demands it. Excellence in your primary specialty creates the foundation for excellence in unexpected roles. The questions from the international officers reflected the global relevance of Maya's experience. A British colonel asked about the integration of support personnel into combat operations. A Japanese major wanted to understand how cultural factors had influenced Maya's leadership decisions. An Australian captain inquired about the psychological preparation needed for soldiers who might be asked to transition between support and combat roles without warning. Maya's answers drew from 15 years of experience implementing the lessons learned during that night in Afghanistan. She had overseen the development of training programs that prepared logistics soldiers for combat scenarios, led research into adaptive leadership under stress, and mentored hundreds of officers who had gone on to successful military careers. But her most significant contribution had been the demonstration that heroism often emerges from competence in routine tasks rather than specialized training in dramatic skills. After the lecture, Maya found herself in her office reviewing correspondence from soldiers around the world who had been influenced by her story. Among the letters was one from Lieutenant Colonel David Park, the former corporal whose life she had saved at Op Viper. Park was now commanding an infantry battalion in South Korea and had written to thank Maya for inspiring his decision to pursue a military career that emphasized both tactical excellence and care for soldiers. Another letter came from Master Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, Maya's former roommate at FOB Phoenix, who had recently completed her own transformation from communications specialist to special operations support. Walsh credited Maya's example with giving her the confidence to volunteer for assignments that had seemed beyond her capabilities, ultimately leading to a distinguished career that had taken her to conflict zones in 3 different continents. But the letter that meant the most to Maya came from her successor as the senior logistics instructor at the War College. Major General Patricia Chun, daughter of the Staff Sergeant Michael Chun, whom Maya had rescued at Op Viper, had written to express her gratitude for the mentorship that had shaped her understanding of military leadership. Chun's own military career had been built on the foundation of lessons learned from her father's stories about the night when a supply sergeant had risked everything to save his life. Maya's final administrative task before leaving the War College was updating the official record of the Op Viper rescue mission. New documents had been declassified that revealed the full scope of the enemy operation that her actions had disrupted. The intelligence analysis confirmed that her successful rescue mission had prevented a coordinated campaign against observation posts throughout eastern Afghanistan, potentially saving hundreds of coalition lives and preserving critical intelligence capabilities. The declassified materials also revealed that Maya's mission had influenced military doctrine development far beyond the United States Army, NATO. Allies had incorporated lessons from the Op Viper rescue into their own training programs, and the mission had become a case study taught in military academies around the world. Maya's demonstration that logistics expertise could enhance combat effectiveness had influenced force structure decisions and training curricula across multiple armies. Maya's transition to commanding the 1st Sustainment Command represented the culmination of a military career that had begun with counting supply inventories and evolved into responsibility for logistics operations, supporting 100,000 soldiers across multiple theaters of operation. Her new position would require her to apply the same principles that had guided her actions during the Viper rescue, understanding complex systems, anticipating requirements, and developing innovative solutions under resource constraints. Change of command ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning at Fort Bragg, the same base where Maya had received her deployment orders 20 years earlier. The reviewing stand was filled with general officers, congressional representatives, and foreign military attaches, but Maya's attention was focused on the soldiers' information who represented the next generation of military logistics professionals. Among the soldiers in attendance were graduates of the training programs that Maya had helped develop, officers who had been selected for advanced assignments based on criteria that emphasized both technical competence and leadership potential. Their presence validated Maya's belief that the most important military capability was the development of soldiers who could adapt to unexpected challenges and excel in roles they had never anticipated. Maya's speech to the assembled formation emphasized the continuity between her experience as a supply sergeant and her responsibilities as a general officer. The principles that guided a logistics specialist during a combat rescue mission in Afghanistan are the same principles that will guide our sustainment operations in whatever challenges the future brings, she explained. Excellence in routine tasks, dedication to mission accomplishment, and willingness to accept responsibility when circumstances demand extraordinary action. But Maya's most personal moment during the ceremony came when she recognized the soldiers' information who had volunteered for assignments that would take them to remote outposts and dangerous locations around the world. Their willingness to serve in positions that required both technical expertise and courage reminded Maya of her own decision to volunteer for the supply mission to Viper, not knowing that it would transform her understanding of military service and personal capability. The evening reception following the change of command ceremony brought together colleagues from throughout Maya's military career. Former students shared stories of how her mentorship had influenced their own leadership development. Fellow general officers discussed the impact of her innovations on military logistics doctrine. But the conversations that mattered most to Maya were with the enlisted soldiers who reminded her that the most important aspect of military leadership was taking care of the people who accomplished the mission. Maya's final reflection on her military career took place during a quiet moment in her new office at Fort Bragg, looking at photographs and mementos that told the story of her journey from logistics specialist to general officer. Among the displays was the Silver Star citation from the Viper rescue, but Maya found her attention drawn to a simpler item, a challenge coin from her first logistics unit at Fort Bragg, given to her by soldiers who had appreciated her dedication to getting the details right during routine supply operations. That challenge coin represented the foundation of everything that had followed in Maya's military career. Her success as a combat leader, her innovations in military doctrine, and her influence on the next generation of military professionals had all been built on the same attention to detail and commitment to excellence that had characterized her work as a young logistics specialist. The transformation from supply sergeant to general had been dramatic, but the underlying principles had remained constant. Maya Rodriguez's legacy would be measured not just by the 8 lives she had saved during the Viper rescue, but by the thousands of soldiers who had been influenced by her example of adaptive leadership and moral courage. Her story had demonstrated that heroism could emerge from any military specialty, that leadership could develop in unexpected circumstances, and that the most important military training was the development of character and competence that enabled soldiers to rise to any challenge. As Maya began her new responsibilities commanding the 1st Sustainment Command, she carried with her the same sense of purpose that had guided her actions during that October night in Afghanistan. She was still a logistics specialist at heart, still focused on ensuring that soldiers had what they needed to accomplish their missions. But she now understood that the most critical supply in any military operation was the development of leaders who could adapt, overcome, and succeed regardless of the challenges they faced. The supply run that had become a combat rescue had taught Maya Rodriguez that every soldier has the potential to change the course of history when circumstances demand extraordinary action. That lesson would continue to guide her leadership and influence the soldiers she served for the rest of her military career. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.